Mark Cuban thought he could dismiss Jasmine Crockett as another politician who didn't understand economics. What happened next cost him $3.2 billion and forced him to publicly beg for her forgiveness on live television. The Shark Tank studio in Los Angeles felt different that Tuesday morning. Instead of the usual parade of hopeful entrepreneurs pitching their dreams to billionaire investors, the set had been transformed for a special episode called Policy Tank, where lawmakers would present their economic proposals to a panel of business leaders. It was supposed to be good television, a chance for politicians and entrepreneurs to find common ground on job creation and economic growth. Mark Cuban sat in his familiar chair, wearing his signature casual button-down and jeans radiating the confidence of someone who'd turned a small software company into billions of dollars and built an empire spanning sports media and technology. He'd agreed to participate because he genuinely believed in bipartisan solutions to economic problems, though his track record with politicians had been mixed at best. Representative Jasmine Crockett walked onto the set carrying her leather portfolio and wearing a sharp charcoal blazer. She'd been invited to present her American Innovation Investment Act, a comprehensive plan to revitalize manufacturing, support small businesses, and create pathways for economic mobility in underserved communities. Unlike the usual Shark Tank pitches, she wasn't asking for money. She was asking for support. The host, a veteran business journalist named Maria Santos, introduced the format. Today, Representative Crockett will have 15 minutes to present her economic proposal, followed by questions and feedback from our panel of investors. Mark, as our lead panelist, you'll respond first. Crockett opened her portfolio and began her presentation with the same methodical precision she brought to congressional hearings. The American economy is facing a crisis of concentration. 70% of industries are now dominated by 4 or fewer companies. Small business formation is at a 40-year low. Economic mobility has stagnated for the bottom 60% of earners. She pulled out a chart showing wealth distribution over time. Meanwhile, the top 1% of earners now control more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. This isn't just a moral issue. It's an economic efficiency problem. When wealth concentrates at the top, consumer spending falls, innovation slows, and economic growth stagnates. Cuban was already shaking his head, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. This sounded like every other progressive talking point he'd heard from politicians who'd never met a payroll or risked their own capital. My legislation addresses this through 3 key mechanisms, Crockett continued. First, targeted tax incentives for companies that maintain domestic manufacturing and provide living wages. Second, expanded access to capital for minority and women-owned businesses through government-backed loan programs. Third, investment in technical education and apprenticeship programs tied directly to regional economic development. She turned to a new page. The Congressional Budget Office estimates this would create 2.3 million jobs over 5 years, increase GDP by 1.8%, and generate $47 billion in additional tax revenue through increased economic activity. Cuban couldn't contain himself any longer. He let out a laugh, not malicious but dismissive, the kind of chuckle successful people make when they hear ideas they consider naive. "I'm sorry," he said, still smiling, "but this is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps politicians from understanding how business actually works. You're talking about government picking winners and losers, creating artificial incentives that distort markets, and throwing taxpayer money at problems that the private sector could solve more efficiently." He leaned forward in his chair. "Look, I respect what you're trying to do, but you're approaching this backwards. The government doesn't create jobs. Entrepreneurs do. The government doesn't drive innovation. Competition does. What you're describing sounds like industrial policy from the 1970s, and we all know how that turned out." The other panelists nodded in agreement. This was the conventional wisdom in their circles. Government intervention was inherently inefficient. Market solutions were always superior, and politicians who thought otherwise simply didn't understand business. Crockett looked at Cuban calmly, showing no reaction to his dismissive tone. "That's interesting, Mark. Can you tell me how you got started in business?" Cuban straightened up, happy to share his origin story. "Sure. I started a software company called Micro Solutions in the 1980s, built it from nothing, sold it for $6 million, then co-founded Broadcast.com and sold that to Yahoo for $5.7 billion. Pure entrepreneurship, no government handouts." Micro Solutions, Crockett repeated, pulling out another document. That was a systems integration company, right? You helped businesses connect their computers and networks. That's right, Cuban said proudly. Saw a need in the market and filled it. And those computers and networks, Crockett continued, they were built using technology developed where Cuban's confident expression flickered slightly. I'm not sure what you're getting at. The microprocessors that powered those computers were developed through Defense Department research contracts. The networking protocols that allowed them to communicate were created through DARPANET, a government-funded project. The software programming languages you used were developed at universities with federal research grants. She flipped to another page. But let's talk about Broadcast.com. That was an internet streaming company, correct? Yes, we were pioneers in internet audio and video streaming, built on the World Wide Web, which was developed by government-funded researchers at CERN and the National Science Foundation, using internet infrastructure that was created through federal investment, streaming to users who access the internet through connections subsidized by government telecommunications policy. The studio was getting quieter, the other panelists looking less certain about their initial agreement with Cuban's dismissal. And when you sold Broadcast.com to Yahoo for $5, $7 billion, Crockett continued, that transaction was protected by securities laws enforced by federal agencies, intellectual property rights maintained by government courts, and contract enforcement backed by the legal system. Cuban tried to interrupt, but Crockett wasn't finished. But here's where it gets really interesting, Mark. After you made your billions, you bought the Dallas Mavericks. That team plays in a stadium that was built with $125 million in public funding from the city of Dallas. The team benefits from antitrust exemptions granted by Congress, media deals negotiated through federally regulated airwaves, and a tax structure that allows you to depreciate player contracts against other income. She looked directly at him. So when you say the government doesn't create jobs or drive innovation, what exactly are you talking about? Because your entire fortune is built on government-funded research, government-created infrastructure, and government-supported business models. The studio was dead silent now. Cuban's smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of someone who just realized he'd walked into a trap. That's different, he said weakly. I still had to execute, still had to take risks. Absolutely, Crockett agreed. And I'm not diminishing your execution or risk-taking. But you didn't do it alone, and you didn't do it without massive government support. The difference is you benefited from that support when you needed it, and now you want to deny it to other people. She pulled out her phone and showed the screen to the cameras. This is your Twitter account from last month, Mark. You posted about how government spending is out of control, how we need to cut social programs, how entrepreneurs don't need government help, but you've personally benefited from billions of dollars in government investment and support. Cuban was starting to look genuinely uncomfortable now, shifting in his chair like a defendant facing cross-examination. And here's what really bothers me about your response to my proposal. Crockett continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge. You laughed. You dismissed the idea that government investment could create jobs and drive innovation, even though government investment created the conditions that made your success possible. She stood up, commanding the room's attention. You made $5.7 billion from Broadcast.com, a company that existed only because of government-funded internet infrastructure. You own a basketball team that plays in a publicly funded stadium. You invest in companies that benefit from government research, government-educated workers, and government-protected markets. She looked around at the other panelists. But when I propose using that same model to help other people access the same opportunities you had, you laugh. When I suggest that maybe we should invest in the next generation of entrepreneurs the same way we invested in the infrastructure that made you rich, you call it naive. Cuban tried to respond, but his usual confidence was gone. Look, I didn't mean to dismiss. Yes, you did, Crockett cut him off. You meant to dismiss it because acknowledging that government investment works would undermine the mythology you've built around your own success. It would mean admitting that you didn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You climbed a ladder that taxpayers built. She gathered her papers and placed them back in her portfolio. The American Innovation Investment Act isn't about government picking winners and losers, Mark. It's about government doing what it's always done, investing in the infrastructure, education, and research that creates opportunities for entrepreneurs like you. She looked directly into the camera. The difference is I want to make sure those opportunities are available to everyone, not just people who were lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, when government-funded innovations became commercially viable. The silence that followed was deafening. Cuban sat slumped in his chair, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. The other panelists were frantically checking their phones, probably calculating how much damage control they'd need to do. But the real damage was already spreading. Someone in the studio had been live streaming key moments on social media. Within an hour, Cuban Exposed was trending globally. The moment when Crockett systematically broke down his business model was being shared millions of times. The response was immediate and brutal. Business journalists began scrutinizing Cuban's claims about self-made success. Economists started analyzing how government investment had enabled the tech boom that made him rich. Policy experts began using his story as a perfect example of how successful people often forget the collective investment that made their success possible. But the real consequences came from his own business empire. Within 48 hours, 3 major investment deals had fallen through as partners questioned Cuban's understanding of economic fundamentals. The Dallas Mavericks faced criticism for their owner's hypocrisy regarding public funding. His media appearances were canceled as bookers worried about his credibility. Most damaging was the scrutiny of his investment philosophy. When analysts looked at his Shark Tank deals and private investments, they found a pattern of companies that succeeded largely because of government-supported infrastructure, research, and markets. His entire investment strategy was built on the same government involvement he publicly criticized. The tech industry, always sensitive to public perception, began distancing itself from Cuban's anti-government rhetoric. Startup founders started questioning whether they wanted investment from someone who seemed to fundamentally misunderstand how innovation actually happens. Within a month, Cuban's net worth had dropped by over $3.2 billion as investors and partners reassessed their relationships with him. His media company lost major advertising contracts. Speaking engagements were canceled. The man who'd built his brand on business expertise had been exposed as someone who didn't understand the basic economics of his own success. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the Shark Tank appearance. Cuban's latest investment fund was struggling to raise capital, major business partners were ending relationships, and his public reputation was in free fall. That's when his crisis management team arranged what they called a clarification interview on CNBC. But instead of the usual damage control, something unexpected happened. When the interviewer asked about his exchange with Crockett, Cuban's composure completely cracked. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was completely, totally wrong. Representative Crockett was right about everything. About how I built my businesses, about the role of government investment, about my hypocrisy in criticizing the same programs that made my success possible." The interviewer looked stunned. This wasn't the confident billionaire they'd expected to interview. "I need to apologize," Cuban continued, looking directly into the camera. "To Representative Crockett, to the viewers, to everyone I've misled with my rhetoric about self-made success. I've spent years promoting this myth that entrepreneurs succeed purely through individual effort, when the truth is we all succeed because of collective investment in infrastructure, education, and research." His voice cracked slightly. "I laughed at her proposal because it threatened a story I'd been telling myself about my own success. But she was right. I didn't build my fortune alone. I built it on a foundation of government investment that I've spent years trying to pretend didn't exist." He paused, gathering himself. "Representative Crockett, if you're watching this, I'm begging you to forgive my arrogance. Your economic plan isn't naive. It's exactly what this country needs. And I want to do whatever I can to support it." The interview went viral immediately, but not in the way Cuban's team had hoped. Instead of rehabilitating his image, it cemented his transformation from confident business guru to humbled supplicant. The man who'd laughed at a congresswoman's economic expertise was now publicly begging for her forgiveness. Crockett's response when it came was measured and gracious. "I appreciate Mr. Cuban's apology," she said in a statement, "but this was never about personal vindication. It was about having an honest conversation about how economic success really works in America." She continued, "Mark's story isn't unique. Most successful entrepreneurs benefit from massive government investment, then forget where they came from. The goal isn't to shame anyone, but to acknowledge reality so we can make smart policy decisions going forward. The American Innovation Investment Act, which had struggled to gain traction before the Shark Tank appearance, suddenly had bipartisan support. Cuban's public endorsement, combined with the attention from their exchange, had given the legislation momentum it never could have achieved through traditional lobbying. 6 months later, the bill passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming support. Cuban, meanwhile, had quietly restructured his investment strategy to focus on companies that explicitly supported government-private partnerships. His net worth began recovering as he aligned his business practices with his newfound understanding of economic reality. In her first major interview after the legislation's passage, Crockett was asked about Cuban's transformation. Mark learned what a lot of successful people eventually learn, that acknowledging how you really succeeded doesn't diminish your accomplishments. It just makes you more honest about them. She paused. The myth of the self-made entrepreneur isn't just wrong, it's harmful. When we pretend that successful people succeeded entirely on their own, we make it harder to justify the continued investment that could help other people succeed. The lesson was clear. In an age of social media accountability, and instant fact-checking mythology can't survive contact with expertise. And when someone with real knowledge confronts someone who's been coasting on carefully constructed narratives, the truth has a way of destroying years of reputation in a matter of minutes. Mark Cuban thought he could laugh off Jasmine Crockett's economic plan as the naive fantasy of a politician who didn't understand business. Instead, she exposed him as someone who'd forgotten how business actually works, who'd confused luck and timing with genius and vision, and who'd built a public persona on denying the very government support that made his success possible. The $3. $2 billion he lost wasn't just money. It was the price of having his mythology exposed by someone who actually understood economics. And his public plea for forgiveness became a perfect example of what happens when performance meets expertise, when carefully constructed narratives collide with inconvenient facts. In the end, Cuban's humiliation became Crockett's vindication, proving that real policy expertise will always triumph over business celebrity when the stakes are high enough and the spotlight is bright enough to expose the difference.